Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Vendor Complementary User Entity Controls, what they are and how to use them to protect your organization webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Questions, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you are unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will be answering some during the webcast. For those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to be logged in individually with your own credentials, answer all 3 of the polling questions that appear on your screen during the presentation, be in attendance for the entire live 1-hour session, and complete the follow-up survey. We'll send a link to that follow-up survey 24 hours after the live session. If you meet all requirements, we will send your CPE certificate within 7 to 10 business days following survey submission. With us today, we have Lisa Mayhill, VinMinder's Information Security Operations Director. She will walk you through all aspects of CUECs. Lisa will discuss the basics of CUECs, why they're important, how to review them, and tips for mapping them. You will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our SOC 1 versus SOC 2, which report to requests from a vendor infographic, the vendor SOC dictionary, how to review a vendor SOC report ebook, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all in the related content widget. With all that being said, I would like to hand it over to Lisa. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jessie. And welcome to our discussion on complementary user entity controls. For today's agenda, we're going to start off with defining what complementary user entity controls are. And then we're going to talk about why they're important in your vendor reviews and due diligence, and why you need to be looking at them to begin with, how often, and then where to look. We're also going to talk about the difference between complementary user entity controls and responsibilities or recommendations. There's been a lot of vagueness and confusion surrounding this in SOC reports lately, so I think this is a great opportunity to call out the differences and really look at what makes a complementary user entity control a CUE, what defines it, and how to tell the difference. Then we're going to move into how to review vendor CUEs. I think this is a great way for us to demonstrate a consistent way to look at CUEs, a tried and true process, if you will, and how to make sure that regardless of industry, regardless of product or service, you're always addressing the things that you need to address. And then we'll move to a quick look at complementary subservice organization controls, or CSOCs. We'll look at a couple examples of those and talk a little bit about what the difference is between those and CUEs. And then we will wrap up with some key takeaways. And then at the end, we'll have a little time for some Q&A. So let's get started, and we'll jump right in. Okay, so first off, I want to say that you're going to hear complementary user entity controls called a couple of different things throughout this presentation because we all say it a little bit differently. So you might hear complementary user entity controls, you might hear CUEs, you might hear CUECs, you might hear CUECs. These are all the same thing. I say CUEs, I think it's just the first way I ever heard it 10 years ago, and so it's just stuck with me. But a lot of people say CUECs and a lot of people say CUECs. But complementary user entity controls, also oftentimes called user control considerations, are controls that the vendor has included within its system in which the user entity, which is you, must implement to ensure that the vendor's control objectives are accomplished. What does that mean? So that basically means that these are controls the vendor says you have to have in place in order for their product or service to operate effectively. Control objectives stated in this description can only be achieved in the correct situation, right? And so the CUEs have to be suitably designed and operating effectively at your organization and function in combination with the vendor's controls. That's the correct situation. CUEs are documented within a SOC report in many ways. Usually it's just depending on the preference of the vendor and the auditing firm, but they should always be called out very clearly. CUEs are meant to ensure that the vendor's control objectives can be met while informing your organization of your responsibilities. The number of CUEs for different vendors and services can vary. There can be 1 CUE or there could be 50. So it really just depends on the product or service and the vendor and how they have set up their operation. Okay, so when we talk about why reviewing CUEs is important, I think there's a lot of reasons, right? But I think it boils down to 3 primary areas. First of all, the vendor has transferred risk back to you by implementing CUEs, right? So they're basically saying, hey, these are things that you have to do in order for our controls to work correctly, in order for our system or product or service that we're providing to you to operate. So it's essentially a control guide that's provided by the vendor to help protect your organization. The vendor is letting you know what you have to do for their controls to be supported and effective. And then if controls are missed or not reviewed, this can have a negative effect on your organization, as the controls that they have in place won't be as secure. So it only benefits you to make sure that you're reviewing these and really implementing them as appropriate. And ultimately, if they're not reviewed and implemented, then there's the chance for an increased risk to you. And then you also have to consider regulatory backlash, right? Depending on what industry you're in, there are requirements. And so if you're not able to put these CUEs into place or you're not reviewing them as part of your regular due diligence, there can be regulatory impact to you or your organization. That's why it's so important to make sure that you're reviewing them and documenting your review. So, in short, when we say, why are CUEs important and who needs to be involved? CUEs are important because regulators care. It impacts operational effectiveness. It actually will help give you insight into your own control environment, which is always a good thing. And it allows for a certain level of control of your organization to ensure a certain level of security. And when we talk about who needs to be involved with these CUEs, it really needs to start with the business units using the product or service. Undoubtedly, you're going to have to pull in information security and IT. And really, we want to make sure that we're assigning CUEs and engaging the right people. And that's just going to depend on what the controls are. Technical controls, more often than not, will need to be involving the information technology and information security. Business-related controls to the business unit. We'll talk more in depth about what to do when, but it's important to understand that CUEs are not a one-man job. So one thing that's confusing about CUEs is that there's often other things that look like CUEs in SOC reports. And so we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth, but when we talk about CUEs versus everything else, we're talking about things like user entity responsibilities, user entity recommendations. We're seeing a lot of these more and more as CUEs themselves become more under scrutiny, especially like in exams and with certain industries and regulations. So really, when we're talking about these kinds of different things that you see, you want to make sure that you truly understand the difference, that you are really focusing on the complementary user entity controls or considerations that are required in order for the vendor's product or service to work right, versus responsibilities or recommendations or user entity controls that are really recommended for you to optimize your use of their product or service. And there's a big difference there, right? And we do talk about that a little bit more in depth, but we get a lot of questions surrounding this because we want to make sure that we're looking at both, certainly, but understanding the difference, because there is a difference between needing something for it to work properly and recommending something for you to get the best out of it. And so you may choose to treat them exactly the same, and that is absolutely okay. That's an internal decision. But some companies only have resources for certain things, right? And so you might need to pick and choose those recommendations, or maybe some of them don't apply to you. So just understanding those differences is going to be really important. So one thing about CUEs that you'll start to notice as you look through multiple SOC reports and you start to really pull them out and address them is that there is consistency in the areas that you see CUEs the most. These are some common examples of CUEs in a SOC report, and these are common examples of control sets, right? So groupings. You'll see a lot of logical access CUEs. This is things like account provisioning, general IT controls and policies, and account management. You know, things like it's your responsibility to make sure that there are strong password requirements before you log into your vendor's application. You'll start to notice things like separation procedures, termination procedures. That is an area where we see a ton of CUEs. And you know, that means making sure that when somebody leaves your company that you have removed their account access to the application or the product and service that you're using the vendor for. And then of course, authorization policies and procedures. These can ensure transactions are appropriately authorized and transactions are secure, timely, and complete. Again, it's another area where these controls are primarily in your control. And then data transmission policies and procedures. And appropriate methods such as encryption can be used to protect data during transmission. Obviously, encryption is going to be something on your side of the wire for this particular type of scenario. But these are some real common control sets that you'll see a lot of CUEs kind of fall into. I think one thing that you'll notice about CUEs as you look through SOC reports and these controls often is that they can often be repetitive across reports regardless of if it's the same vendor or not. And that's because, again, they fall into a lot of the same categories. So you might see that CUEs are consistent across software products. Because really when we're talking about software, there's a lot of very specific things that will fall into the user entity's control that would make sense belong in your responsibility. These are a couple of examples of what a CUE could say. The first one, user entities are responsible for controls to provide reasonable assurance that output reports are reviewed by appropriate individuals for completeness and accuracy. And really what that's saying is, hey, if we provide you a report, it's your responsibility to read it and make sure that it's complete and accurate, and then let us know if it's not. Otherwise, how would we know to fix it? The second one, user entities are responsible for implementing authorization policies and procedures to ensure that transactions are appropriately authorized and are secure, timely, and complete. That one's pretty self-explanatory. And again, it's really just saying, hey, these are the things that are in your control. So we would expect you to have controls in place to make sure that that happens in order for our product or service to operate effectively. So CUEs can exist in either a SOC 2 or a SOC 1 report. Like everything with SOC 2s, there's an element of the trust service criteria. So CUEs in a SOC 2 address and will map to the trust service criteria for security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, or privacy. The organization being examined for a SOC 2 report gets to select the trust service criteria and a scope that they're examined against. So common criteria are those that are common to all 5 of the trust service categories. Controls can address common criteria or individual trust service criteria. So having an understanding of those 5 trust service criteria is going to be important to kind of see how those CUEs map back to them. SOC 1 reports, of course, don't address trust service criteria, so the organization is being examined and tested on internal controls that the vendor themselves have selected relevant to their financial operations. However, the organization being examined doesn't get to determine the scope of the exam as all the controls are tested. So your CUEs for a SOC 1 could be against any of those particular controls that are called out as controls to be audited in the SOC 1. So I think when I'm talking to a client about CUEs or somebody who's trying to understand what is relevant to them or not, I think one of the most important things about CUEs is to understand that they are required. They are necessary. They are a must. So I always look for that language when I'm looking for CUEs in a SOC report. Unfortunately, not every vendor documents as clearly as others. So you should always see some language that says complementary user entity controls, and you should always be seeing some narrative that says, hey, the following controls are required, the following controls are necessary, to really make sure that they're defining that they are complementary user entity controls and not something else. So this is an example where they say the following user entity controls are assumed to be implemented by user entities and are necessary for the service organization's service commitments and system requirements to be achieved. And basically all that's saying is the following controls we're assuming that you're putting in place because they are required in order for us to deliver this product or service to you the way that you would expect us to. The next example is similar. It says services are designed with the assumption that certain controls will be implemented by user entities. Such controls are called complementary user entity controls. And it goes on to talk about how they can't obviously do everything, that there are some things that have to fall back on the users. And so you want to make sure that you're reading the paragraph before the complementary user entity controls so that you can understand, are they truly CUEs or are they something else? Are they required or not? Because there's obviously a different approach when something is required versus recommended. So this is an example. This first one in blue is actually an example where a vendor calls out that complementary controls at user entities or complementary user entity controls are not required. This is a statement you will see often in a report when CUEs are not required. It says complementary user entity controls are not required or significant to achieve the service commitments and system requirements based on the applicable trust service criteria. So that's important because it's basically saying, hey, there's nothing that you have to do as a requirement in order for us to provide this service, which is great. I would love to see all vendors put this in there if they're not required. Most of them do, but not all. This is another example of complementary user entity controls. It is a much wordier version, which you'll see a lot as well. And the reason I put this example up here is because we talk about in the next couple of slides why complementary user responsibilities are not the same thing as CUEs. And I just want to call out that a lot of times you'll see the word responsibilities, as you see here in the second paragraph, underneath CUEs. And the thing to remember is that if they've called out that the CUEs are required and then they list them as responsibilities, those are still CUEs. Where you'll see in the next couple of examples is when they call them specifically responsibilities and then list them out, and you'll see the difference. But I just wanted to provide another example of what CUEs can look like, because the language can be confusing. So I put this example in because ultimately this is probably the best example I have found of the difference between complementary user entity controls and user control responsibilities. If you look at the first paragraph, it talks about how these controls are designed to provide reasonable assurance that the principal service commitments and system requirements can be achieved without the implementation of complementary controls at user entities. As a result, complementary user entity controls are not required or significant to achieve the principal service commitment and system requirements based on the applicable trust service criteria. However, in order for user entities to benefit from the platform system and its controls, the following responsibilities should be considered by user entities. And then it lists out a control. We are seeing this more and more, where vendors are saying, hey, there's not any required controls, but these responsibilities are really the only way that you're going to get full benefit from the service that we are offering you or the product. And I think it's really important to understand that there is a difference, and you want to really be reading the QE section and the responsibility section, because I think we have to approach controls that are required versus recommended differently, especially when we have a set amount of resources. So are they all important? Of course. Anytime the vendor is saying, hey, you need to do these things, we need to be paying attention. But there is a difference between something being absolutely required, that there is a regulatory responsibility, a responsibility to the control to make sure that your vendor is able to provide their service, and a recommended control to make sure that you're getting the best out of that service or product. And so it's just important, I think, that we recognize the difference and we start paying attention to that, because this is the first year or 2 years that we've really seen those things being pulled apart and stated separately. So this is just another example of responsibilities within a SOC report versus QEs. It's interesting because I think a lot of times people want to just, understand the difference in the most simplistic way possible. And I know I keep saying required versus recommended, but really the best explanation I've ever heard to explain the difference between QEs and responsibilities is that ultimately user entity responsibilities are activities that allow customers to benefit from the use of a service and system, whereas QEs are certain controls that customers have to perform in a very defined manner in order for the service organization to meet the commitments or the system requirements. And so I think it just further highlights that there's just a difference between required versus recommended, but also that responsibilities really are a way to help you benefit from the system versus the system operating correctly.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, are you currently tracking CUECs for applicability and documenting when CUECs are satisfied? Yes, somewhat, no, or not sure? Lisa, we have some time now to answer a question from the audience. And this question is, aren't CUECs required in all SOCs?
So that's a good question. There's a lot of confusion around the word required. So complementary user entity controls, as defined, are required to implement by the client. They are not required in a report if they don't exist. So what I mean by that is a complementary user entity control is truly the vendor saying, hey, our product or service is not going to work unless you do this control. It won't work correctly. So you have to do this control in order for our product or service to work. So if there are any controls like that that require the client to perform an action in order for the vendor's product or service to work, then the vendor is required to notate that in the SOC report. So if they exist, if controls like that exist, they're required to put them in the SOC report. But they're not required to have CUEs or CUECs. So if they don't have a control that you have to do in order for their product or service to exist, you won't see it in the report. And there's a lot of confusion around that because there's other controls, and we talk about this in this webinar, responsibilities and whatnot, that are recommended that make the service or product work best, but they're not required. So you should always be checking for the CUEs, and you should always make sure that you're understanding the difference and making sure that you are implementing ones that are truly complementary user entity controls, CUECs. Those are required for you to do.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are the results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Just a reminder that in the related content widget, you will find our SOC 1 versus SOC 2, which report to request from a vendor infographic available for download. The type of SOC report that you'll want to request may vary depending on the vendor and the products and/or services they provide to your organization. Grab this resource to learn more about which type to request. Lisa, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Jessie. So when we talk about CUEs, a lot of people want to know, like, how can I easily find them? Ultimately, CUEs can be in a couple of different places in a SOC report. It's really just up to how the vendor presents the information. You can find it in the description or section 3 of the SOC report, as well as the tested controls section of your vendor's report. CUEs that are found in the description section, which is section 3, will often include details on controls and how they relate to the control objectives found in the report, usually in a table format or a list format. This section is often found towards the end of the description section. And CUEs can also be found in those tested control section or section 4 of the report, where they'll actually be right with the control itself. So you'll see the control, and then underneath it, it will show, you know, that there's a complementary user entity control that goes along with it. Controls may be documented right within the control objectives to which they are mapped. So it just really depends. In my experience, 85% of the time you're going to find it in the section 3, the description of the system, towards the end, and it will have its own little subsection. This is just a little bit more information on where you can find them. Of course, finding those CUEs is really only going to be half the battle. Understanding what CUEs mean to your organization is critical because they're going to outline to you and as the intended user of the product or service, the roles and responsibilities and obligations that you have in ensuring the stated control objectives are effective for your organization. So you just want to make sure that you're adding CUEs to the list of things that you're looking for as you're going through SOC reports. And I think this actually is going to bring us to our next poll question.
Our second poll question of the day is, have you ever been asked to demonstrate that you're reviewing and implementing CUECs? Yes, no, or not sure? Lisa, I have another question here that we can go ahead and answer. And that question is, should IT be responsible for CUECs?
Thanks, Jesse. So there's not really a black and white answer for this, unfortunately. I think that it depends on the structure of your organization, and I think it depends on your resources. But it is very important that technology controls be implemented by the appropriate people. So if it's a control that talks about logical access settings or specific IT settings that need to be done from a technical standpoint in your hardware or software, then at the very least, your point of contact that the QE is assigned to should have a way to pull in IT. The basis of a complementary user entity control is ultimately security. The vendor is saying, hey, these controls have to be put in place in your organization. You have to do these things in order for our product or service to work correctly. So if it's a technical control, then you're going to need to pull in the technical people. And so that's why it's so important to have the right people reviewing your SOC reports, because they'll know who to get to do the appropriate controls. So does IT need to review QEs? Maybe not, but they need to be involved in the process of implementing them. That's obviously, there has to be some kind of relationship there.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. In the related content widget, you will find the vendor SOC dictionary. This resource provides you with a glossary of terms for SOC reporting. Be sure to check it out. Back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Jesse. It's really interesting to see responses to that question. And ultimately, it's a great lead into really this next part, which is talking about reviewing QEs. There's a methodology that I always recommend when we're talking about QEs, because I think it's important to understand how to approach the QEs in a really consistent way across industry and across vendors. And it really starts with documentation. QEs are the controls that you as the user entity have to have in place as part of the service provider's control environment, right? You have to review them annually at the very least. Really should be obviously reviewing them on the SOC cycle. But more important than that is that you have to document that you're in compliance with them. This is especially the case if you're subject to SOX 404 or FDICIA. And we're going to talk about each of these steps a little bit more in depth in the next slides. But really, the best path for reviewing QEs is to follow this methodology consistently and to document each step. So first, you want to look at associated control objectives, right? So it's not enough to just understand the QE. You want to understand what it maps back to. What control objectives is it a part of? And then you want to determine which QEs apply to you, because not every QE is going to apply to you based on your use of that product or service. So understanding your relationship with the vendor and how you use that product or service is going to be critical, because it's going to allow you to weed out any QEs that you don't need to waste your time or resources on. And then assigning each QE. We'll talk about this more in depth in the next couple of slides, but really it's very important to make sure that there's a level of accountability to each QE. And then you're going to determine which QEs are already addressed, because frankly, a lot of these things you'll already be doing. Low-hanging fruit, if you will. And then you want to start addressing each applicable QE. And the biggest and most important piece of that is recording how each QE is addressed. Document, document, document. And then you want to continue to assess those QEs on an ongoing basis. The next few slides, we're going to jump into each of these steps a little bit more in depth. So how to review your vendor's QEs. The very first thing that I recommend is to make sure that you're reviewing QEs with the associated control objectives. This is going to ensure that the right context is understood. This really needs to be done by a qualified individual who understands the use of the product or service. They have to understand the context of the control and then the technical and business impact of implementation. It's important because that person can then make sure that they are assigned out appropriately. You're going to want to determine which CUEs apply to you. Not all of them are going to always apply. Some CUEs aren't going to be applicable based on your implementation of a product or service, and only someone who understands that implementation as well as your environment is going to be able to know that. And you don't want to be putting in place controls that are not relevant, because that can oftentimes create conflict between controls as well as unnecessary burden. You want to make sure that each CUE gets assigned to a person or team or role for responsibility. I suggest role, because then it doesn't matter who is sitting in that seat. It will not get lost in the shuffle. And it's important to assign CUEs to a specific role in your organization so that they don't get lost. Role accountability ensures that you're always covered, regardless of who is sitting in that seat. And then you need to determine which CUEs you're already addressing. So like we looked at a few slides back, there's some common areas that CUEs fall into, right? And a lot of those areas are things you're already doing. Logical access, for instance, is a very common one that you'll see complementary user entity controls fall. And the majority of organizations are addressing logical access. So in many scenarios, you're already doing these things, and those are easy wins, low-hanging fruit. So take them when you can. Okay, so step 5 is going to be address each applicable remaining CUE. So steps 1 through 4 are going to help you whittle down to just those that really matter to you and your organization. And then you're going to want to record how each CUE is addressed and make sure you're asking the following questions. Is the CUE similar to any of your organization's existing controls? Who owns that existing control and takes responsibility for it? And how often is this control validated or tested for effectiveness? You really want to make sure that you are documenting this. It's critical, because there's no point in doing the CUE work if you're not going to document it so that you can prove that you've done that work. And then number 7, you want to assess CUEs with each new SOC report or with any significant internal changes. I say with each new SOC report because if you have a vendor or that issues SOC reports more than once a year and you're only doing this work annually, there is a very good chance that you could miss a new CUE. They change, and so you want to make sure that you are following the cadence that the SOC reports are issued when we're talking about CUEs, because you are responsible for the most current CUEs. CUEs are not always stagnant. They should always be reviewed with every SOC cycle. And then 8, repetitive but necessary, document, document, document. Make sure you record this work, because a lot of times, depending on your industry, regulators and examiners will ask you for evidence that you are implementing CUEs. Tips for mapping CUEs. Ultimately, it's your organization's responsibility to ensure you're meeting any regulatory or contractual requirements with your controls. Map CUEs to these requirements and then analyze what other requirements have not yet been fulfilled. Mapping CUEs to appropriate business units will ensure that controls are implemented by the proper SMEs. Consider which department would be most knowledgeable about each control and who would be able to best accomplish the control objective. And then assigning the implementation of CUEs to the SME will provide the best assurance that the control objective is effective and ensuring security. When mapping these controls to your organization, you want to make sure that the activities you are implementing are also included in your governance documentation to aid with consistency and accountability. Remember that CUEs are designed to give your organization confidence that your security isn't compromised by your vendor relationships. It seems a little bit overwhelming sometimes, I think, for people to take the CUEs out of a SOC report and figure out how best to work with them. And really the best advice I can give you is to put it into a table. That's ultimately what we do, and it works great because you're able to say, okay, here is the complementary user entity control. create columns for what you already are doing, who you are assigning them to, and then what the action item is, and then once it's completed, you can add a date. But mapping those CUEs back to different things is going to be, I think, critical to your organization of the CUE information. So another area where we get a lot of questions is regarding complementary subservice organization controls. And people often ask, are CUEs and CSOCs the same thing? And the answer is that they are not. They are different because they are designed for different people or different roles in this process, right? This relationship that vendors and subservices and clients have. So complementary subservice organization controls, or CSOCs, are controls related to your fourth-party vendors, so your vendors' subservices. This is going to provide additional clarity of how your vendor is addressing their own vendor risk management obligations, so how they're handling your fourth parties. These are controls that the vendor is saying, our subservice organization is responsible for these controls. Your organization outsources products or services to third parties so that you can provide the best products and services to your customers. Likewise, your vendors may outsource a portion of those services to a third party, making them your fourth party or subservice organization. Depending on the criticality of that vendor relationship, the subservice organization could also be considered critical to your organization. Therefore, it's really great and essential to have visibility into the subservice organization controls, including how they protect and secure data. So you do want to keep track of those complementary subservice organization controls to some extent. You want to make sure you understand them and the role that those subservices play in your relationship with the vendor. These are also usually found in the narrative or section 3 of the report, and they are very clearly called out, usually right after the subservices are defined in the SOC report. So this here is an example of CSOCs within a SOC report, specifically a SOC 2 report. So ultimately what the vendor is doing here is laying out some controls that they would expect to be implemented by the subservice organization in order to meet the applicable trust service criteria mentioned in the second column. It calls out that the subservice organization is not within the scope of the examination, which means it was carved out of the SOC audit. And it basically is just highlighting that these particular controls will be taken care of by the subservice, that there's a level of expectation that the subservice will have these controls implemented, and that in order for this product or service to operate correctly, the subservice needs to handle these controls appropriately or as predefined. Again, you'll see this in usually the narrative section, section 3 of the SOC report, right under or alongside of where the subservice organizations are defined and called out.
Our third and final poll question is, if reviewing CUECs is part of your due diligence process, how often do you review them? Annually, with each SOC cycle, one and done, other, or not sure? Lisa, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And this one is, why aren't responsibilities required?
So this goes back to one of our earlier questions and things we've talked about in this webinar too. And so it's very hard because I think a lot of times the language is vague. So the difference between a complementary user entity control, a very specific CUE or CUEC, and a complementary user entity responsibility or a entity responsibility is that the responsibility is the vendor's way of saying, look, these aren't required. You can do these or not. Our product or service will still operate. It'll work fine. It'll be as secure as we've made it. But these controls will make it better for you and will optimize your use of our product or service. So we recommend that you do it. They're not required because, the vendor, when a vendor says something is required, they have a certain responsibility to that. That's why CUECs are, often checked in an exam or a regulatory audit. You can't make everything required or else nothing is required, right? Like everything can't be important. So there's this difference, right? You have required CUEs, recommended responsibilities. And, I think it's important that you look at both. Obviously, you internally should determine if a responsibility is required, but that's an internal review. That's not the vendor saying that they're required. But you should definitely be looking at both if they have both. And if they say there are no CUEs, but they say there are responsibilities, you should still be looking at those responsibilities because there is going to be risk involved for you if they're not in place.
And here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. Before we continue, I would like to mention that we have our How to Review a Vendor Stock Report ebook available for download in the related content widget. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Lisa.
Okay, thank you so much, Jessie. So after our final poll question, we are ready to wrap things up with just some key takeaways. So CUEs is a big topic, and I feel like a lot of times the information is a little bit repetitive, but I think it's simply because as easy as it is to explain what CUEs are, they're very complicated to understand and to work through. And that's because there's so much variation of how they are presented in SOC reports. There is, of course, a standard, but you see it in each SOC report a little bit differently. I have noticed over the last couple of years that there is a lot more structure with them, of course, given the regulations, but also that there is a certain degree of an increase of vagueness as well. So really, when you're talking about CUEs, you want to make sure that there is some type of call out in the SOC report. They should either be called out that they are there or that they are not. There should be some language within the SOC that says yes, CUEs are needed or no, CUEs are not. They're usually in Section 3 or Section 4 of the report. I can think of maybe 1 or 2 times that I've seen them in a different section other than 3 or 4. Most times they're in Section 3. However, sometimes they are in the testing section of the report along with the controls that they correlate against. So CUEs are needed for the product or service to operate effectively. I think that's a really key takeaway here. We really want to understand that they are required, right? They are necessary. Complementary user entity responsibilities or recommendations are different. Those are not required for the product or service to operate effectively. They are recommended for optimization. The language around the controls is just as important as what the vendor calls them. You want to make sure that you are reading the controls and understanding them and pulling in the right people. And then, of course, documenting. This includes identifying the CUEs and how you're going to select those that apply, as well as satisfy those that apply. And that methodology should be defined as well. Examiners will also want to see that you've put a process in place to identify how you're going to address them. And then finally, CSOCs are like CUEs for a vendor subservice. So you don't have any actionable items with CSOCs, but you should be aware of them, and it is important for you to understand them and their impact to the product and service that you're using with your vendor. Because ultimately, those are your fourth parties that are fulfilling those CSOCs. So this was a ton of information today. We have some time for Q&A, so I will turn it back over to Jessie, and then I will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Lisa for her time in sharing some important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On June 6th, our How to Read and Review a Vendor Stock Report, a report walkthrough, and on June 18th, our Assessing Vendor Risk, a Deeper Dive webinar. We hope you will be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Lisa, our next question is, how do I record CUECs in case they ask for them in an exam?
Okay, that's a great question. So really the best way to record them is in, honestly, Word or Excel or some type of template. I say template because the important thing is that you're consistent. You want to make sure when you record them that you're recording them and your assessment of them and application of them the same across your vendors and across products. So whether it's a Word document, an Excel file, a database, or however works best for your process, it just needs to be templated so that you make sure you're always doing the same thing regardless of who you're looking at or what product or service you're looking at.
Great. Our next question. Is there an easy way to pull the controls out of the stock report into some form that can be used for reviews? Right now, we copy from the stock report into a Word document and it's very cumbersome.
Great question. I wish the answer was yes. If anybody knows an easy way to pull them out, I'd love to hear it myself. Ultimately, at this point when we're still kind of looking at electronic documents and PDFs, I think is generally how we see stock reports the most. You really are probably going to be copying and pasting unless your company can come up with some type of API or whatever to pull out data. We do it the same way for our clients, right? We actually have a person who goes and reviews the stock report, pulls out the complementary user entity controls, puts them into a database for us so that they can be downloaded in Word and Excel. So it is, the same way that we're currently doing it, unfortunately.
Great. Our next question. I've never heard anyone call CUECs CUEs. Why do you call them that?
That's a great question. So it's interesting. When I actually started at VendMinder, third-party risk management, I had never worked with stock reports before. This was 8-9 years ago. I had worked on the government side in really straight cybersecurity. And so when I was introduced to stock reports and QEs or CUECs or CUECs, my mentor called them QEs. And I actually never knew for the longest time that anybody called them anything else. So it's just the way that I learned it. It's kind of like data versus data, I think. It just kind of depends on what you get stuck with. I do find that I'm trying to use a little bit different. I hear CUECs a lot and CUECs a lot, but I'm stuck on QEs. But thank you for the opportunity to explain that.
Thanks, Lisa. Our next question. I may have missed where I can find this, but where could I find the explanation of all of the trust service criteria? Is this only available to CPAs?
Sure. So it's not only available to CPAs. So the trust service criteria are defined. You can find information on the AICPA website. You can Google it. But the trust service criteria really are defined by the AICPA because obviously it relates to stock reports. But it's security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. And each of those, of course, kind of map back to what we call the cybersecurity information security triad. And I think we actually have a I'm so sorry. I think we have a data sheet on them, so I can certainly look that up and get that back to you. But no, they're available to anybody. I mean, you can research it, and you can kind of get that information from the AICPA website. I'm pretty sure they have it available without having to be a member.
Great. Next question. To whom are the responsibilities of validating and confirming that CUECs are met for each vendor product acquisition typically assigned? Risk management, IT, and individual owner in the business line.
So this is a great question, and I actually saw this question answered or asked in multiple ways in the Q&A. So hopefully this kind of answers it for everybody. But ultimately, there's not a right answer because it depends on the QE itself, right? So it really is, one, determined by your process and your resources, and then two, determined by the content of the QE itself, right? So very technical QEs that have to do with implementing actual like things like access management or doing things with hardware and software, you're going to want to engage your IT department, but that's an internal process to each organization, right? I think the biggest piece is identifying who is responsible for seeing it from start to finish, and a lot of times that's going to be the business unit or the people that have the relationship with the vendor that can facilitate those check boxes, right? Whoever in your organization can make sure they say, okay, this is the responsibility that we have, and see it through to the end to say, okay, here's evidence that we have completed it and we have made sure to put this in place. And that could be, depending on your organization, your resources, how your third-party risk management program is set up. It could be a bunch of different people, but it really should be who can see it from start to finish and engage the right people, really.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. I recently received a SOC 2 Type 2 report that the CUECs section cannot be found within the SOC report at all. Have you ever seen a SOC report without CUECs, and what would be the best way to address this?
Sure. So ultimately, QEs should be rare, right? So you should not see them in every single SOC report all the time. I would be concerned if I saw them in every single report, because ultimately what they're saying is you have to do this for us to operate effectively. And really you don't want to see that in every single thing. So it's totally normal to not see them in a report, to not see them in a SOC 2, to not see them in a SOC 1. What's not normal is for that to not be addressed at all, right? So if there are no CUECs or QEs or CUECs, they should call that out. They should be saying QEs are not required for this report, so that you can have confidence that there's no action on your part. Now I say that, but I do see a lot of reports where they're just not addressed at all, but they should be. They should be addressing whether they are needed or not.
Great, thanks so much, Lisa. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you again, Lisa, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you again to Lisa for her time and content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you will find thousands of free educational resources, including ones related to vendor SOC reporting. If you would like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we will get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request a CPE credit. On behalf of Vinminder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.